built on October the 2nd, 1902, by the Jinx Shipbuilding Company of Port Huron, Michigan, who also built other ships that we've covered on Dangerous Tides, such as the SS Eastland and the SS Henry Steinbrenner. It was commissioned by the Cowle Transit Company, a newly formed transport firm associated with Globe Iron Works. She was also the first ship to be named for John Bestwick Cowle, one of the owners of the Globe Iron Works and a prominent citizen of Cleveland, Ohio. She had a length of 420 feet, a beam of 50 feet, and a gross tonnage of 4,731 tons. At the time of her construction, she cost $270,000. Adjusted for inflation, that's $10 million today. Other features included coal-fired boilers and a triple expansion engine that would register up to 2,100 horsepower. She would be enrolled into service on April the 1st, 1903, in her home port of Cleveland, Ohio. For the first few years of her service, there weren't many events, but a collision within her early years would be enough to give pause in retrospect. On May 31st, 1906, the John B. Cowle would sink a British steamer by the name of Erin off the coast of St. Clair, Michigan. 5 of the Erin's crew were lost that day, and the John B. Cowle would require $10,000 for repairs. After an investigation on July 3rd, 1906, by the United States Steamboat Inspection Service, the captain in charge of the John B. Cowle at the time was not found to be at fault for the collision and was exonerated. Around the year of 1909, the John B. Cowle was still registered with the Cowle Transit Company, but would be operated by the United States Transport Company for further shipments. Several days prior to the collision that would eventually sink the Cowle, a deckhand was talked into quitting by his father and left her at Detroit, Michigan. 3 more deckhands would leave her at Two Harbors, Minnesota, before all the replacements would be found to continue the voyage. 2 days after the stop in Minnesota, the replacements would drown on the Cowle at her final voyage. Midway through the season, on July 12, 1909, the SS John B. Cowle was loaded up with 7,023 tons of iron ore at Two Harbors, scheduled to be downbound for its home port, Cleveland, Ohio. A new steel freighter by the name of Isaac M. Scott was scheduled to be on her maiden voyage that day, headed upbound for Duluth, Minnesota through Whitefish Bay. Given the foggy conditions of Whitefish Bay that morning, and radar wasn't available during this era of shipping, Captain Russell Heminger of the Frank M. Goodyear was following the Scott with all the pilot house windows open, standing propped on the side, still for intense listening, and navigating by clock, compass, and the lights and whistles of other vehicles. At 4 a.m., Captain Wallace G. Rogers of the John B. Cowle reduced his engine to half speed and blew fog signals at intervals of less than a minute. The Isaac M. Scott suddenly came into view, running full speed ahead, and broadsided the Cowle. Captain Archie MacArthur would ring the engine order to the telegraph to reverse engines and ordered hard left, but by then it was too late. The Isaac M. Scott would run into the John B. Cowle, almost cleaving her in two. The first mate of the Isaac M. Scott would blow her whistle, and when the Isaac M. Scott's engine found the reverse order before impact, the bow pulled out from the massive hole in the John B. Cowle, which soon listed and began to flounder. The crew of the Isaac M. Scott threw out a lifeline to the deck of the John B. Cowle. 3 sailors would scramble, hand over hand, to the Isaac M. Scott, while other sailors, then for the rail, jumped overboard to get away from the suction of the ship. Captain Rogers put on a life preserver on his own son, who was sailing with him at the time. The captain himself was washed off the deck as the John B. Cowle sank, but managed to get a hold of some of the wreckage and was rescued within 45 minutes. The steward and the captain's brother, B. Rogers, would testify after the collision. When the ship sank, I was stuck in a whirlpool, drenched and whirled until I thought my legs would be pulled off. I saw a body alongside me. It was Will Thomas, my assistant. I tried to revive him when a broken hatch cover came up and struck the lad on the head, crushing it. My life preserver came off, and I was floundering in the water. Another hatch cover came up. I grabbed the ring and pulled myself on it. I saw a foot sticking up from beneath it. Found it to be Thomas McKern, the son of the chief engineer. I pulled him up, and he revived after a while. The lake was covered with wreckage all around, and all around the fog could be heard the cries of help. But it was 3/4 of an hour before the yawls of the Scott had been loosened and put in the water. The John B. Cowle sank in 3 minutes, taking 14 of the 24 crew members with her. 2 engineers, 4 firemen, 4 deckhands, the second cook, a porter, and an oiler would all go down with the ship. The crew of the Frank H. Goodyear would report the collision in later testimony through a series of sounds. First, a rumble that sounded like distant thunder, then a distant groan like tortured steel, accompanied by a series of deep-throated whistle blows, and shouts followed through the distance, followed by an earthquake-like rumbling. A hollow silence followed, then more shouts and screams. Captain Russell Heminger would sound the general alarm and slowly approach the disaster, coming to a full stop when the men were in the water just off the bow. The Frank H. Goodyear's crew would lower lifeboats to rescue sailors, using her spotlight to search through a, quote, jumble of wooden wreckage, oil drums, life rings, and splashing sailors, until she came upon the Isaac M. Scott, with a large hole in her bow. Captain Rogers and his first mate would be taken on the Frank H. Goodyear to Duluth, while the rest of the crew would be picked up by the Isaac M. Scott and transported to Sault Ste. Marie in Michigan. The loss of the John B. Cowle was valued at $15,000 more than what she was at the time of her construction. The iron ore was valued at $25,000, but had remained uninsured. The Isaac M. Scott was found to have suffered $30,000 worth of damage, with 2 forward compartments open to the water. A subsequent settlement on behalf of the families of the crew would be paid by the Virginia Steamship Company in March of 1910 to the amount of $20,000 in damages. The U.S. steamboat inspectors ruled that both the John B. Cowle and the Isaac M. Scott were going too fast for prevailing conditions and suspended Captain Rogers and pilot Edward E. Carleton for 30 days, despite Rogers having claimed that he checked down to Bear Steerage Way. Pilot F.W. Worthimer of the Isaac M. Scott would be beached for a year for excessive speed and failure to signal. The Frank H. Goodyear was launched on August 23, 1902, at the American Shipbuilding Company in Lorain, Ohio, and was commissioned by the Buffalo and Susquehanna Iron Company, a subsidiary joint venture between Brown & Company's Vice President William A. Rogers and a founder of S.H. and C.W. Goodyear Lumber Company, who also happened to be the ship's namesake. Frank Goodyear was the brother of Charles W. Goodyear, who founded the company and its subsidiaries that followed afterwards. After making their fortunes in lumbering manufacturing, they built other companies to support their businesses. One such subsidiary is the Buffalo and Susquehanna Railroad Company, which was meant to support lumber and coal to his sawmills in New York. Frank Goodyear was also an early developer of the Pullman sleeping car for the railway and had his own private car named the Cinema Honing. Goodyear was reportedly so proud of the car and the vessel he built, he had installed a duplicate of the Cinema Honing car as a private deck house on the spar deck in 1903. Despite the freighter being built as a workhorse for his railway and iron manufacturer, Frank Goodyear himself would use the ship as a private yacht whenever he could and kept it in pristine condition. The Frank H. Goodyear was built at a length of 436 feet with a width of 50 feet and a weight of 4,815 gross tonnage. She ran on coal-fired boilers with a triple expansion engine at 1,450 horsepower. As if the installation of the Cinnamahoney replica was not unique on its own, the Pullman car turned deckhouse had all the luxuries of the turn of the century, including a fully stocked bar, copper tub, and grand piano. This made Frank H. Goodyear a one-of-its-kind ship, and its design a standard of opulence that likely would not be seen on the Great Lakes again. The Frank H. Goodyear had an unremarkable service for the first 7 years of its life, save for an asset transfer from the Buffalo and Susquehanna Steamship Company in 1904 under the management of John Mitchell, who would operate the freighter under Mitchell and Company for the remainder of its service. Frank Goodyear himself would pass away from Bright's disease 3 years before her final voyage, with his brother managing the F.H. and C.W. Goodyear until his passing in 1911. On July 12, 1909, the Frank H. Goodyear was involved with the rescue of the survivors of the John B. Cowle after monitoring a routine passing between her and the Isaac M. Scott went horrifically wrong that day due to the excessive speed order by both Captain Wallace G. Rogers and Captain Archie MacArthur of their respective ships. The Goodyear's captain, F. Russell Heminger, would be central to the rescue of the survivors of the John B. Cowle, as well as the crew of the Isaac M. Scott. Heminger would serve as captain until a year later. On the morning of May 23, 1910, the Frank H. Goodyear was traveling downbound with a load of iron ore in a heavy fog to be delivered to a port in Lake Erie. At 5:45 a.m., Goodyear was blasting its whistles according to regulations, and breakfast had been underway for the crew. Captain Heminger considered the fog to be a little bit more than just an annoyance, much like the captains of the Cowle and Scott, but had all the pilot house windows open along with the whistle blasts. Also, like the captains of the ships he was involved with, slowing down was not a part of his plan. A captain was more likely to lose his license from not moving enough cargo than losing their ship. There were also no separate lanes for upbound and downbound traffic on the lake, so vessels passed within shouting distance of each other. One of the deck watches made a warning yell, and Captain Heminger would order the ship's whistle to blow 5 short blasts, a warning to the other ship encroaching the vehicle. Around 6 a.m., off Point Aux Barks, Michigan, the 500-foot-long SS James B. Wood would ram the Goodyear amidship near the bow. According to the surviving crew members, the collision was so loud it, quote, sounded a lot louder than the shrieking of the Wood's whistle, from the tearing and the scraping of the metal. Many of the crew had already picked up and fastened life preservers, including second cook Frank H. Bassett, his wife Lillian Bassett, who was a porter, and his mother, Emma Bassett, who served as a steward. Frank's 3-year-old son, John, was there to keep them all company. All the crew attempted to launch the lifeboats of the SS Frank H. Goodyear, but the ship was sinking too rapidly. One of the crew aboard the Wood would share his account with the Columbus News. I was standing on deck, having just come from my quarters, when I heard the alarm whistle. A moment more, and 2 boats came together. I ran forward to find that our boat had not been damaged to any great extent. I could see that the Goodyear was sinking. Standing amidships, with the entire crew huddled closely together, I could see the first one and then another one jump overboard. Another crew member of the Wood would paint the scene of horror with their account. Suddenly, the Goodyear made a lurch to one side and went out of sight, leaving only a big hole in the water, and the suction carried the crew down with it. According to Frank's account, he had taken immediate steps to save his wife and son by fastening life preservers onto both of them. Around the time he was doing so, the boat jerked under him, and something struck him in the back of the head, knocking him unconscious. Eyewitnesses had stated both Lillian and his son had come to the surface after the suction of the water going into the SS Frank H. Goodyear had pulled them down. The air pressure from the inrushing water was so great, it blew some of the hatch covers off and shot them in the air before the Frank H. Goodyear sank. One of those hatch covers struck and killed both Lillian and John. Emma Bassett would also give her account of the sinking that day. According to her, she was scrubbing the cabin floors when she heard the whistles of both ships.
In fact, we were so close, it attracted my attention, and I went on deck. A moment later, the crash came, and I grabbed one of the life preservers.
She slung the preserver over one arm before jumping over the rail. She went underwater for a long time and then came back to the surface, only to sink again. Finally, she came to the top again, but this time she managed to hang on to some floating debris until sailors in a yawl boat from the SS James B. Wood pulled her out of the water.
It was awful. While I was probably in the water for a few minutes, it seemed like hours.
The SS Sir William Simmons was nearby the collision when it happened. Captain William McElroy had heard both vessels blowing danger signals, followed by the groan of tortured steel and the death rumble of the Frank H. Goodyear. Slowing his own vessel to a crawl, he eased through the fog in the collision. He heard the people in the water screaming for help. Finally, he came to the dark outline of the James B. Wood in the fog. Ordering his ship to a full stop, he ordered all hands on deck to throw out life preservers in the direction of the voices. But soon, the voices vanished. Grabbing the pilot house's megaphone, Captain McElroy asked if there was anything more he could do. Captain Gibson shouted back that all was done that could be done. After checking his vessel, Captain McElroy would ease the Sir William Simmons back on course for Detroit, Michigan. The survivors were able to get away from the ship's suction, still held on to the hope that they would be rescued by the Wood. Captain Gibson of the James B. Wood ordered his men to lower the lifeboats and make every possible effort to save those in the water. The collision would claim 18 lives, 16 men, 1 woman, and 1 child. The crew of the James B. Wood were only able to pick up 5 survivors: Frank Bassett, his mother Emma Bassett, George Grant, the engineer, Frank Mollick, fireman, and Captain Russell Heminger. Captain Gibson and the James B. Wood's crew remained at anchor near the collision for 7 hours in hope of rescuing more. When the fog lifted, however, it was clear that the rest of the crew had perished. Gibson would sail his damaged vessel with a 6-foot hole in the port bow to the Grand Trunk Railway dock near Point Edward, Canada. Captain Heminger would notify the Frank H. Goodyear's owners, Buffalo and Susquehanna Steamship Company, of the loss of the ship and life. The vessel was fully insured. Upon investigation, it was found that Captain Gibson, like Captain Heminger, was going too fast for the prevailing conditions, and it failed to ensure the course of the SS James B. Wood was not a hazard to oncoming vessels. Additionally, his first mate, Don McClellan, who was on duty for the pilot house, had his certificate suspended for 60 days for the same violation. Captain Heminger would have his license suspended for 60 days. The SS Isaac M. Scott was launched on June 12, 1909, at the American Shipbuilding Company's Lorain, Ohio shipyard. Commissioned by the Virginia Steamship Company on July 2nd of that year, the Isaac M. Scott would be named for then president of LaBelle Iron Works, and her launch was a huge public event at the time, with the Toledo Blade considering her one of the handsomest of the large freighters of the Great Lakes. She was 504 feet in length, with a beam of 54 feet and a weight of 6,372 gross registered tons. The freighter had a triple expansion engine that was powered by coal-filtered boilers at 1,760 horsepower and would be assigned to Fairport, Ohio, as her home port. Her nearly identical sister ship, the Charles S. Price, would also sink with her during the Great Lakes storm of 1913. 10 days after her completion, Captain Archie MacArthur would be assigned to her maiden voyage, sending her to Duluth, Minnesota. Captain MacArthur, a Scottish-born resident of Ashtabula, Ohio, was known to be a full steam ahead captain who often threw caution to the wind, both in the literal and figurative sense. Any form of inclement weather was not a concern for MacArthur, which led to his censure after the sinking of the John B. Cowle for failure to signal an excessive speed. Still, the Virginia Steamship Company and his crew considered him to be a reliable captain and would remain in command of the SS Isaac M. Scott throughout her life until her final voyage. For further details on the disastrous maiden voyage of the Isaac M. Scott, we recommend listening to the previous episode of Dangerous Tides that covers the John B. Cowle. On the evening of Thursday, November 6, 1913, the Isaac M. Scott sailed from Cleveland, making a stop at Ashtabula to take on a load of coal destined again for Duluth, Minnesota. A storm was noticed on the western side of Lake Superior and was quickly moving toward Lake Michigan that night, with the Detroit News predicting it as a moderate to brisk winds with occasional rain for the upper lakes and fair to erratic conditions for the lower lakes. As a precaution, the United States Weather Bureau posted hurricane warnings with white pennants above red and black storm warning flags around their offices. Ignoring these warnings to his own peril, Captain MacArthur took 27 other crewmen aboard the Scott out of the St. Clair River and into the epicenter of it all. After 4 years' experience, he was never one to be intimidated by the threat of stormy weather. Captain MacArthur would make the same decision that and many other lake captains made that day. Just a few miles ahead of him was the SS John A. McGean, destined to be another victim. By midnight on Friday, November 7th, another vessel, the steamer Cornell, would be caught 50 miles west of Whitefish Point in a sudden northerly gale and sustain heavy damage, almost forcing her captain to limp to port. The storm found the day before would consolidate with a string of low-pressure centers from Canada noted as Storm Number 1, with warm air being pushed from the Carolinas and Virginias, with Storm Number 1 moving east to Lake Huron, while strong northern winds developing over Lake Superior on Saturday, the 8th. On Sunday, the 9th, Storm Number 2 would develop in the same area, with the northern portion of it sweeping warm air over the colder air of Ohio, creating heavy snow and strong winds along Lake Huron, exceeding hurricane force. Around 3:30 that afternoon, Captain A.C. May of the SS H.B. Hawgood reported watching that the Isaac M. Scott as she entered Lake Huron. Captain May was heading southbound and remarked that he thought Captain MacArthur was a fool to leave the river. Captain May would save his own ship and crew by beaching it near Serena's Lake Huron Hotel. His sighting would be the last time anybody would see the Isaac M. Scott afloat. Following the lead of the SS John A. McGean, Captain MacArthur ran the Isaac M. Scott along Michigan's eastern shore to protect her from the deadly northeast winds. Struggling against heavy winds, churning seas, and blinding snow, every one of her crew worked frantically to stoke the engines, man the pumps, and steer the ship on course in hopes that it would sail through to the other side of the storm. What Captain MacArthur didn't anticipate was the gale's sudden change in direction from northwest to northeast, with the unexpected shift creating waves that tossed the freighter from one direction while the winds blasted her from the opposite. As she bucked and heaved, the Isaac M. Scott and her crew fought a desperate but unsuccessful battle for survival. Captain MacArthur had one last chance to save the freighter. A safe option would be to turn his vessel into the relative shelter of Saginaw Bay, where he then could head to the western shore of the Michigan Thumb and ride out the storm at anchor. That sort of caution, however, was not in Captain MacArthur's nature, and so he ordered the Isaac M. Scott to turn into the open lake. Just a few hours more, and the Isaac M. Scott could limp into the Sioux Canal and Sault Ste. Marie and give his exhausted crew much-needed rest. However, MacArthur's decision to head into Lake Huron would both doom his ship and his crew. As every man worked on board feverishly at their station to save the struggling freighter, a grim moment of terror must have seized the Isaac M. Scott's crew as she listed hard to her port side. Giant waves shattered the ship's skylights over the engine room and water poured into the hatches. She stood no chance against the storm. She had listed too far over to recover her balance and foundered. As soon as she keeled over, all 27 men, save for Captain MacArthur, drew their last breaths on board. No order to abandon ship had been given. It would have been a futile attempt, as any lifeboat would have quickly been overwhelmed by the lakes of Huron and the hurricane-force winds of what was considered the worst storm in Great Lakes history. Hypothermia would have taken the lives of anyone immersed in the frigid water of Lake Huron within minutes. A battered lifeboat washing up on the Canadian shore would be the only wreckage announcing the SS Isaac M. Scott's loss. On December 11th, Captain Archie MacArthur's body washed up near Southampton, Ontario, still wearing his life preserver. No other bodies from the Isaac M. Scott were recovered. As a result of the massive loss of life on the Great Lakes, along with extensive damage to cities along the shore, the U.S. Weather Bureau would increase efforts to better weather forecasting and more rapid communication through weatherproofing utility cables after a death from downed power lines. Along with the 28 crew members of the Isaac M. Scott, the total death loss from ships that foundered during the storm resulted in 225 other casualties, totaling up to 253 lives lost on the Great Lakes. The Isaac M. Scott would tie 3 other ships for the greatest loss of life during the storm on the lakes, along with her sister ship, the Charles S. Price, the John A. McGean, and the SS Argus. Still, it is worth telling these stories to remind us that even in the modern era, no human is completely capable of taming the fury of nature. Thanks for joining us today. The episode is dedicated to all the lives of the 28 men lost on the SS Isaac M. Scott, as well as the efforts of the researchers, maritime experts, divers, and archaeologists that allow us to continue the tales of these forgotten vessels. If you like what you've heard today, please don't forget to like and subscribe. And as always, may the fair winds guide you through dangerous times.